Um, Super duper. So yeah, thanks everyone for turning up and being here with us for the event, Nuclear Information Services event, Nuclear Secrecy, Democracy, Nuclear Weapons and Disarmament in the UK and US. Very glad to be here with you all. So you're all muted at the moment, but you can still have your videos obviously are on. You can turn them off if you wish, but when we do the Q&A, you can ask questions that way. That will be at the end. So at that point, please unmute, and if you like, turn your cameras on, or you can put your questions in the chat, or raise your hand, and then we'll hear your questions. So the event is also being recorded, just to give a flag up on that. So just to give you a sense of how the event's going to flow, I'm going to introduce the panelists and ask them some questions about their work. And then they're going to ask each other some questions and have a bit of chat. And then you can ask some questions. So get thinking about what you'd like to ask our panelists, who are super experienced and knowledgeable. So just to give a brief overview of them in order of them speaking, to begin with Alex Wellerstein. Dr. Alex Wellerstein is a historian of science who specializes in the history of nuclear weapons and nuclear secrecy. He's an associate professor of science and technology at the Stevens Institute of Technology. And his first book, Restricted Data, which I have here and I've just been reading, I'll give it a big plug. There we go. It was published in early 2021 by University of Chicago Press. And he's also the creator of Nuke Map, which is described as a mapping mashup that calculates the effects of the detonation of a nuclear bomb. So definitely check all that stuff out. Secondly, we have Dr. Kennette Benedict, who is a lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago and is a senior advisor to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And she was executive director and publisher of the Bulletin from 2005 to 2015, and has previously been the director of international peace and security at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. And Kennette received her PhD in political science from Stanford. Thirdly, David Cullen, who's our own director here at NIST, at Nuclear Information Service, joined us in 2016. He's the author of several reports, including Trouble Ahead, Risks and Rising Costs in the UK Nuclear Weapons Programme, and has a background in environmental, social justice and disarmament campaigning. He's a trustee currently for the Conflict and Environment Observatory. So welcome to you all. I'm going to start kicking off with Alex, if that's okay. So Alex, hi there. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great to be with you. So yeah, really enjoyed reading your book. It's really clear and succinct and was very easily digestible, which is not always the case with nuclear weapons topics. So I really appreciated that, and has a great bibliography and reference section. So can you outline the main focus of your book and why you wrote it?
Sure, thanks so much. And I just want to thank everybody who's tuned in on this as well. And thank you for hosting this discussion. It's really great. My book is a history of nuclear secrecy. Specifically in the United States, not because that's the only story you could tell, but it is the first story of nuclear secrecy you can tell, and is the one that I was able to tell. And it is tracing both the idea of secrecy, the sort of the desire for secrecy in nuclear weapons. You have sort of a motivation to want certain types of information to be controlled and in limited circles of people. And then you have to put that into practice. You have to make that real in the world. It's not enough to just say, I wish nobody knew about this. You have to create institutions and laws and safes and barbed wire fences and training and all sorts of regulations about this to make it actually real. So the book is an attempt to show how that happened from the very earliest days of thinking about nuclear weapons in the 1930s, ideally all the way up to the present world we live in today, though obviously I have less to say about the present in the book than I do about these previous times. And it's also making the argument that one of the things that makes nuclear secrecy so historically interesting and so thorny, one is that it's very tightly connected with ideas about science and whether or not science is open and whether or not there are truly secrets of nature and whether or not you actually can control this kind of concepts. The relationship between science and technology. How important are secrets? How important is the kind of information you can write down to getting a certain type of technological outcome? Does secrecy actually prevent another country from getting nuclear weapons? These sorts of questions are out there. Does the secrecy harm science as well? And then lastly, questions about secrecy in a democracy. How do you make the restriction of information and the restriction of free research and speech compatible with a world in which you have freedom of the press and an informed citizenry? And do they endanger themselves over time? And so what I'm trying to do in the book is trace out how these conversations took place and what the results were of these conversations over the long 20th century in particular.
Great, that's very helpful. Just to pick up on the starting point with the Manhattan Project and the birth of the bomb. So you write that the Manhattan Project was born secret. It was central to the creation of the US national security state. And you also highlight the importance of the Atomic Energy Commission. So I'd just like you to touch on that and expand a bit more on how you think, what impacted those institutions, the development of the Manhattan Project. What impact did you really think it had on US democracy and institutions?
So the nuclear secrecy that we come to think of as being the all-encompassing permanent secret, this starts during World War II. There's an existential fear initially, which is that the Germans are making nuclear weapons, and the only way to stop them is by making sure that they don't know that we're making them. This transitions as the Germans drop out of the picture into, well, we want to surprise the Japanese with these weapons, and also keep it from, they believe that if information about this work bubbled out before they were ready, it could lead to Congress shutting down the project. It could lead to a rejection of the project before it had been successful, and they didn't want that to happen. What's interesting is that many of the people involved thought of this secrecy as being extremely temporary. They saw it as being a wartime expediency for very specific short-term purposes. And what happens, and this is the case with a lot of US secrecy during World War II, it's not uniquely nuclear weapons. There is a lot of secrecy in World War II, but it's things like, when is D-Day going to happen? And after D-Day happens, that's not a secret anymore. That secret has expired. What's interesting about nuclear weapons is they become the site for thinking about permanent secrets, for thinking about secrets that don't expire because they're secrets that will continue being dangerous to the United States and the world indefinitely. Nuclear proliferation is envisioned as sort of a problem that is always going to exist unless you find some other way to tackle it through treaties or disarmament or something like that. As a result, secrecy itself becomes conceived as something that might be sort of ever stretching outward. And this is where it ties into this national security state idea. The atomic bomb becomes the sort of anchor rhetorically for thinking about why secrecy needs to be in place generally. It's the ultimate secret, it's the ultimate existential risk. And if you can justify keeping the atomic bomb secret, then it just becomes about justifying, well, if nuclear war is the ultimate expression of what happens if things go totally wrong, then we can keep lots of things secret if they tie into leading to nuclear war. And so you start to see this expansion of like, what is an existential threat and why should secrecy be used to it, that follows World War II in the United States in a way that really does not exist beforehand. American secrecy in general is a lot newer than most people realize. It dates from about World War I. We actually copied British laws on the subject, good job. But did not really implement them in a massive way until World War II, and then they don't become sort of permanent until after that. So this is sort of what I'm tracing in the book. It's not so much that the bomb is necessarily exactly the locus of all secrecy, though in some cases it is for certain sorts of practices like declassification. That doesn't exist before nuclear weapons, the concept of it. They come up with the first systems of that around the Manhattan Project after the war. But as an idea, it solidifies this sort of belief that secrecy is this valuable, necessary thing, and then that just expands. It goes from the bomb to even the US Postal Service today has people with top secret clearances, right? Things that don't look anything like nuclear weapons fall under this umbrella eventually.
That's very useful. I just want to pick up again on what you're saying about the threat of secrets coming out and the importance of secrecy, and could you expand a bit more on who was feeling threatened by this? I mean, you highlight how congressional oversight posed a threat to the bomb and could have stopped its development. You just mentioned that. So as well as this internal threat was the external threat of, for example, originally Nazi Germany, fear of them getting the bomb, and the Soviet threat. So to what extent do you see the absolute secrecy that FDR initiated and other US leaders afterwards? What was the mix there? What was the balance between their domestic political concerns and how real was the external threat? Was it real or imagined or fabricated? How would you summarize that?
So there are a lot of reasons that can motivate you to want the secrecy in the first place. And again, as I said, the Nazis are a good reason to be motivated, right? They're, especially for a lot of these scientists, that the people who initially are pushing both for nuclear weapons and are pushing for secrecy are refugees from Nazi Germany, right? They are the ones who are absolutely the most afraid of the idea of Nazis with nuclear weapons for very good reasons, right? They have firsthand experience with that kind of regime. But it's interesting that there end up being lots of motivations, as we're talking about, internal ones like fear that Congress will shut you down if they know what you are doing. This is a very real threat for many of the administrators who are already running into problems with getting Congress to fund unusual defense projects. There are also issues where, for example, they want to use secrecy as a way of managing the scientists. General Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, is very explicit that this is how, as he puts it, you keep the scientists you make them stick to their knitting. You make sure that they are focused on their project, because his stereotype of a scientist is somebody who would take this opportunity to do interesting physics research that has nothing to do with nuclear weapons, and he wants them staying on task. So secrecy as sort of human resource management. What ends up sort of evolving is an ostensible justification of secrecy in some sort of external threat. And it moves from the Germans to the Japanese to the Soviet Union very seamlessly. And today it has now moved very seamlessly to China, of course, as well as more Russians and North Korea and things like this. There's sort of an unlimited number of potential enemies out there, though the nature of the enemy can shift. So the Soviet Union is a sort of technological equal eventually, whereas like Iran is not, right? Iran is a much lower technology partner. In the 1970s, they start to get worried about terrorists getting information. And depending on who you imagine the enemy might be, that changes what you imagine is the kind of information you're trying to keep secret. So one of the ironies about worrying about terrorism, if you're only worried about Russia, you can declassify lots of information about early nuclear weapons that are so crude that no state would make them today. But if you're worried about non-state actors, terrorists, now that's the information that's actually the scariest. And the information about sophisticated nuclear weapons, they're never going to build those kinds of things. This is the ostensible justification. There's also other sorts of justifications like avoiding oversight, avoiding public discussion, because public discussion can force policy to go in directions you don't want to. This is even present during World War II. They definitely don't want those scientists talking to the president and maybe influencing him into thinking about whether or not they should use a weapon against the city or not. So secrecy gets used for lots of purposes, some of which we might regard as legitimate. And then there's a whole category of like secrecy used to cover up waste, abuse. One of the first things the Atomic Energy Commission, when they took over from the Manhattan Project, decided to make sort of permanently secret was the fact that during the Manhattan Project, the Army had injected people with plutonium without their knowledge to see how it moved through their bodies. And the Atomic Energy Commission said, essentially, if we release this, we're going to get blamed for this, even though we didn't do this. The Army did this, and they're going to shut us down. So we need to keep it secret indefinitely, even though we recognize this is a serious ethical lapse. So that is something we would normally view as not a correct use of secrecy today. But secrecy ends up being an immensely useful tool for people in government and even between government agencies, for example, to fight out their own battles. It's not like you're behind the fence and suddenly everybody's sharing information. It ends up being an incredibly useful tool, even if it's a counterproductive one ultimately.
Yeah, that leads on to my next point, which is there was debate around, even from people who are very much in favor of nuclear weapons, they understood that secrecy doesn't lead to security. There was for example, an understanding that to have a degree of scientific openness is necessary to develop science and develop better nuclear technologies, because then you have better weapons and are better able to reach your strategic ends. But so maybe could you talk a bit more about that kind of debate or that conversation within the establishment, and also touch on different approaches to national security from within the scientific and political establishment, and how was attempts at international control of the bomb discussed, and why was that strangled, and how did that end, or hopes to that end at the start of the Cold War, for example, which seems probably to be one of the best chances to constrain the bomb?
Sure. So from the beginning, scientists in particular were very concerned that the secrecy could be counterproductive to science. If you need science to build these weapons and to build better weapons, then you need scientists to be operating in a way that is going to be productive. And they associate secrecy with like working in industry, which academic scientists detest, and also harsh governments like the Soviets and the Nazis and totalitarian regimes. And this is going into World War II, why these American scientists, they're willing to be secret for a short amount of time. Even then they chafe under the secrecy. They don't like compartmentalization. They don't like need to know policies. They constantly find themselves breaking regulations just to get their jobs done and tell lots of stories about this. But they're willing to do that in the short term. But they believe very strongly that if you tried to do that in the long term, you will strangle science. You will strangle the, I'm mixing metaphors here. You'll strangle the goose that's laying the golden eggs, right? If you put it under too much secrecy. And so they start thinking even during World War II about what the future would look like if you didn't have secrecy, but you also didn't want endless arms races. And their essential conclusion that most of them take is you need some kind of what we would call today arms control. You need a treaty, presumably by the brand new at the time United Nations, that would say we will not have nuclear weapons in any state, and everybody will get rid of their nuclear weapons. And you have to make this enforceable. It has to be real. The way they go about this is not through trying to restrict information, but by latching on the things that are easy to see and measure. So they'll say you can't build the big factories that enrich uranium unless the United Nations is overseeing it or inspecting it, things like that. It's a very material focus, because they argue that it doesn't matter how many chalkboards you have with diagrams and equations. If you don't have the fuel for these weapons, enriched uranium or plutonium, then you don't have a bomb. And those things, enriched uranium and plutonium, they require very large industrial efforts, at least at the time. And so that was seen as the way in which you would get the security you want, a world without nuclear threats, without having secrecy at the same time. Now, obviously, it didn't work out that way. The Soviets were not willing to sign on to this. They were not willing to sign on to, they did not trust the United States. They did not trust the United Nations. We didn't trust them either. So there was so much mutual distrust that this didn't really get that far, though it is amazing in retrospect that the US did officially endorse this plan, even if it never went ahead with it. I would also just say that there's other ways to imagine getting security. Again, without having secrecy, the most amusing, if maybe not plausible, is from Edward Teller, the inventor of the H-bomb. Edward Teller is interestingly very hawkish and very conservative, but also very against secrecy throughout his career. But it's not because he thinks that we should have disarmament. It's because he believes that if we didn't have nuclear weapons activities concentrated in only a very small number of places, in very secret environments by a small number of people, that we would be leaps and bounds ahead. So in his mind, every graduate student should be working on nuclear weapons in the United States. Think about how far you'd be. And this is, in some ways, I find it's almost a parody of itself, but it's a great example of the ways in which secrecy and security can be completely decoupled in many different ways, even ways we probably don't endorse.
Great. And finally, my last question is on the opposite of that, which is the idea of anti-secrecy. So by the 1960s, you state that in the book, secrecy had become so embedded in the fabric of American bureaucracy and the American security mindset that it's difficult to imagine anything different at this point. And you say later on that the problem of controlling nuclear weapons was mainly a political rather than a technical problem. And that, quote, we might think of anti-secrecy as the revolution necessary for contemplating what the new order might be. So can you expand a bit more on what you mean by anti-secrecy, how that worked, and what your thoughts are on the importance of democratic practices, scientific freedom, and societal openness if the US and maybe other states are going to make progress on nuclear arms control and disarmament?
So secrecy becomes not just a practice and not just a sort of goal, but it becomes a sort of overarching way of thinking about how the operation of the government should be, what security is tied into, how the national security state ought to operate. And so you can think of it as a sort of mindset that ends up starting relatively small and practical and becoming sort of taken for granted and suffusing every aspect of thinking about national security. It's a sort of reflex at that point by the sort of mid-Cold War. You start to get a development of people who have a sort of opposite reflex. And this starts a little in the 60s. Obviously, some of these ideas had been out there before, but it sort of gels into its own almost ideology by the 1970s in the United States, which I call anti-secrecy. And this is just essentially the assertion that all secrecy is bad, secrecy is corrosive, secrecy in and of itself is an ill, that if you got rid of the secrecy, lots of other ills would be it's not that secrecy is in the service of corruption, for example, it's that secrecy is the cause of corruption. Secrecy is the problem to the anti-secrecy point of view. And this grows throughout the 1970s. And today we live in a world where that point of view is very well representative. The things I'm describing are probably known to every person on this call. The idea that secrecy is its own sort of evil unto itself, right? And yet we live in a world where these two things are competing. We can all easily recognize the secrecy mindset as well. The question is, how do you get beyond either of these, or how do you get beyond secrecy? The problem with anti-secrecy by itself is it isn't actually a replacement. It's just a negation. It's just saying, I don't like that. If you actually corner somebody who's very strongly anti-secret and you say, okay, do you think this should be out there? Do you think that should be out there? It becomes a really tricky awkward conversation, because they often don't want everything necessarily to be unsecret. They just don't trust the people who are in charge of that, which I can understand. I'm not unrelating to that. What's interesting to me is contemplating ways of thinking about security that don't rely on secrecy, but are not just about negating secrecy. So two examples. One is international control, which I mentioned, right? And this is essentially the basis of all of our arms control treaty. It's not about, treaties are not about secrecy. They are about physical material things. So material security is an alternative approach to secrecy. Doesn't require secrecy, doesn't need it, is a totally different way to think about controlling nuclear weapons. Another example that I just offer up as a different field, which has thought about this, in computer science, especially cryptography, they are very explicitly open. The best encrypting protocols for our communications and our credit cards and things like that are not ones where only a small number of people know the magic secret, but are ones that are guaranteed safe because of the inherent mathematics of them. And everybody can check the code. And because we can all check the code, we can all have faith that the code works, without it being sort of an obscurity that's keeping us from doing it. And this is just an interesting alternative where radical openness, in this case, is what's leading to increased security and increased safety, much more than sort of proprietary secrecy or government secrecy, things like that. Now, what would that look like in the nuclear realm? I don't know. This is a separate sort of issue, but I like these because they give us very concrete ways of saying, okay, there are other ways to achieve secrecy that, to achieve security that don't just involve saying, I don't like secrecy. We cannot like secrecy. We can all agree secrecy has many ills, but unless we have a bigger framework to replace it with, it's not going to be compelling.
Great, thanks for that. That's really helpful. And thank you for answering those questions so wonderfully. Please, everyone, think of some questions for Alex and either, put your hand up at the Q&A or put them in the chat, which is somewhere around here, your screen. So I'm going to move on to Kennette, but thanks again to Alex. So hi, Kennette, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, how's it going? So can you explain what originally drew you to working on nuclear issues? And can you outline your position on the question of nuclear possession, arms control and disarmament, and maybe highlight some of the experiences you've had over your career working on these issues and key lessons you've learned?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And thanks. I want to add my thanks to you and to others organizing this session. I think these are really critical issues, and I appreciate the chance to be here. I was working at the MacArthur Foundation and working in the International Peace and Security Program. We had a focus on broadening the discussions about security beyond nuclear weapons. This is in the late 80s. And I worked with Jerome Wiesner, who was on the board at the time, who was the science advisor to John Kennedy and who'd been very involved in the negotiations of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which was put in place in 1963. So I learned a lot from him. And at the end of the Cold War, as Alex and others have noted, there was a pretty drastic reduction in nuclear weapons on both sides. Some of it unilateral. President George H.W. Bush took it upon himself to reduce nuclear weapons, especially in Europe, but also in the United States. And then with the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program that Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar put together, we really did a terrific job, frankly, of transparently and jointly reducing the nuclear weapons in the United States and Russia. And so that was all really good, but it didn't go far enough. And so I shifted my attention a bit from this broad discussion of international security, which is still very important. What do we mean by it? How do we achieve a security and safety for all people on a range of dimensions, including environment and climate change? And instead, I focused much more of my attention on the nuclear weapons issues because there are so many still here. And there are so many on a state of high launch readiness, which is truly, truly terrifying. So I went to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists as a way of trying to address that problem of the lack of awareness. Even among people who had worked in government, they assumed that as soon as the Cold War was over, all the nuclear weapons were gone. But it wasn't true. And even people who should be knowledgeable didn't really understand that we hadn't really gotten rid of everything. So the Bulletin had a doomsday clock. And I saw that clock as a way of trying to reach a broad range of people about the existential threat from nuclear weapons. In 2007, when we had a kind of a reinvigoration of the clock, a redesign, we also included climate change in that calculation, because by this time we understood that climate change was also an existential threat to the planet and one that humans had created. And that is the key, that the nuclear weapons we created and we can get rid of them. And so my interest focused somewhat on nuclear weapons. I had a little bit more expertise there than in climate change, but certainly see both of them as connected and issues that we really need to address.
Thanks. That's a very nice summary of your background. I just want you to expand a bit more on the doomsday clock. So you've written that all but a small group of experts have been kept out of nuclear decision-making on the grounds of national security. Even so, citizens have found effective strategies over the years to influence these decisions. Pushing back the hand of the doomsday clock for good will depend on our ability to develop new habits of thought and what I call a democratic theory of disarmament. So I think that links up with what we were talking about with Alex about questions of moving forward from the current institutional problems with secrecy and the nuclear mindset. So could you talk a bit more about what you mean by a democratic theory of disarmament, how you came to think of it that way, how you think disarmament in the US might happen in future, and perhaps how you see that occurring in terms of bottom-up grassroots action and top-down presidential leadership? You touched a bit on there about Nunn-Lugar and the Presidential Nuclear Initiative.
Yes, well, as I looked back at history and looked at the times when there had been changes, dramatic changes in nuclear weapons policy, especially by the United States, it seemed to coincide with citizen movements and citizen protest against nuclear weapons. In the 1950s, the harms from nuclear testing became known. Doctors were finding nuclear radioactive material in babies' teeth, in mother's milk, and it aroused the public. And they began to march and claim that nuclear testing was a bad thing, that it was ruining our health, it was harming us. And there were negotiations going on as well at an elite level, at the leadership level. But I think the protests gave leaders, especially in the United States, a kind of permission to take nuclear weapons seriously and to at least reduce testing, literally driving it underground, but stopping atmospheric testing, because the idea is if you can't test, you won't develop nuclear weapons. So at least that addressed a citizen complaint. In the 1980s and the freeze movement, we also saw at that time, at really the height of the Cold War, again, an attempt by citizens in Europe, especially, the CND was extremely important to this. Greenham Common, the women's strike at Greenham Common in the United Kingdom, as well as the freeze movement in the United States. Again, starting in the 1980s, and by the 1989, we saw the collapse of or at least some demise of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Cold War. And I think it's not, correlation is not causation. I understand that, but it seems to me that the citizen awareness allowed leaders to have a larger understanding of what was happening. And in fact, I think people have said that Gorbachev, seeing the Greenham Common strike, it gave him courage to actually think that there were people in the UK and the United States who might be receptive to the idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons. And so he approached Reagan with the idea. So I think as I looked at it, it seemed to me that citizens had a role to play. It took extraordinary mobilization and effort, but democracy in that sense was really key to the move towards disarmament and at least nuclear weapons reduction.
That's really interesting. Can you then highlight today, you've said that or observed that arms control, or you've quoted Lawrence Friedman on this, arms control is so boring despite being essential. I think it's paraphrasing of Lawrence Friedman. So if we're going to think today about how to revive not necessarily the same type of enthusiasm or focus on nuclear issues today, what can we learn from the past to make arms control and disarmament more engaging, so it's higher up the political agenda? What lessons can we learn? Obviously, we have the TPNW, the ban treaty, which has made enormous strides and has given focus to the issue internationally. But what other lessons, or how would you assess that treaty's progress today?
I think what's so clear about the ban treaty, the prohibition on nuclear weapons, is that it starts from the effects on human beings of the release of these nuclear bombs and their explosions. It's not how many nuclear weapons you can have on the top of an ICBM or angels on the head of a pin, to put it another way. It's not about esoterica, it's about actually what happens when you use these things. And so to understand and to look clearly at the harms, as they call the humanitarian effects of using these bombs, I think does begin to focus people's minds on a couple of things. First, how terribly dangerous these weapons are, and how little control we as citizens have over these weapons. In the United States, for instance, the president is the one person is in control, if we can put it that way, of these bombs. And he or she is the one to launch them. We don't have any say in it. Congress doesn't need to declare war. Right now, the Nuclear Posture Review says that these can be used under Trump. These can be used really anytime the United States feels threatened, not even by a nuclear weapon, but any other time that it feels that its national interests are at stake. So the real problem here, I think, is to talk about how unequal the bomb is, how it's really just basic fairness in a way. One person can have the ability to make a decision which would constitute perpetrating genocide in our name, in my name, or on the other hand, suffering genocidal attacks from someone else, most likely Russia. So the idea that we focus on the harms, I think, is what the ban treaty does so well. And I think it does bring it to a human level, rather than talking about warheads and how many there are and who has them. It really is a way in which we can all begin to focus our minds on what's happening with nuclear weapons. And so I think it's important, in following on Alex's discussion, that we have a much more open discussion about the weapons. Secrecy is not our friend in this. Secrecy really hides and protects leaders and elites and policy elites from the questioning that the questions that most of us have about nuclear weapons, and shuts down public debate. And I think that's what the ban treaty does, is to open up public debate. As you may know, I think something like 150 cities in the United States now have passed resolutions in support of the ban, including Los Angeles, Des Moines, and Washington, D.C. 4 states in the United States have also passed resolutions to support the ban. Now, many people may think these are either naive or foolhardy, but what the point of it is to raise the level of discussion and awareness. And I think that's why the treaty ban is so important. It also shows that people around the world, maybe not in the United States, but developing countries all over the world, are concerned about them too. This is not just a problem for the nuclear weapon states, it's a problem for everybody.
Great, I agree totally on that point. Let's look at a bit closer at where we are currently with US nuclear politics, if that's all right. So maybe you'd also like to touch on the past decade. Obviously, we had Obama, and he came to power, he came into office, and he had his Prague speech and highlighted his ambition or intention to work towards creation of a world free of nuclear weapons. Then we had President Trump, who obviously went a different direction. But what's your assessment of the current administration's direction of travel on nuclear issues? We've heard some kind of disturbing noises about what's going to be in the forthcoming nuclear posture review, the continuation of extremely high spending on nuclear modernization across the triad. How do you assess what's going on there, what's going on internally, what should be the priority for the Biden administration, and what are the prospects of having a more progressive policy over the course of his administration?
Well, of course, we all had hopes that there would be a shift in thinking, fairly radical shift in thinking. But I think the lesson from the Obama administration, where we thought, the Prague speech had great promise to it, where we thought the president and his advisors would take care of things, we realized that that didn't happen, and that we as citizens need to keep putting the pressure on. Politicians respond to pressure. They respond to political pressure, to noise in the outside of the system. And so I think it's important for us to, even if we voted for Biden, even if we think he's a good president, to keep the pressure on and to keep telling him and his advisors that we do not want nuclear weapons. I hate to say this, but the pewter lining of the Trump administration was that he drew attention to the fact that one person, the president, can launch a nuclear war. and got people a little bit agitated, at least for a few minutes, and reminding them of just the crazy system that we live in, that has 800 weapons on our side in a high state of launch readiness, ready to go in 15 or 20 minutes. So in a way, he pointed out to us how just crazy this system is. With Biden, who seems more measured, we may have a sigh of relief, but we really shouldn't, because these weapons are dangerous no matter whose hands they're in. And so I think that we need to keep the pressure on. I think the major obstacle, and one you've written about, Tim, is the Pentagon and the military industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it. It is a bureaucracy and we know bureaucracies have tremendous inertia. It's very difficult to move them. And the money that will be spent by contractors also is tied to congressional districts. So to look at the full circle of this, we need to also place pressure on congressional members who may think that they are doing well by their citizens, their constituents, by continuing to have these jobs. But the jobs produce things that are very dangerous. And we have other needs, other things we can be doing with that money. Of course, COVID, the pandemic, brought that up in obvious terms, but the need for clean energy, for ways to address climate change with new kinds of technologies and jobs, that's the place where science, technology, and manufacturing and other kinds of economic development needs to go, not into these dangerous weapons. So it's a little more complicated than that, obviously, but I do think that this is a time when we have a president who is at least sympathetic, I think, in general, to the goals that many of us have, but needs a lot of help and a lot of push from the rest of us.
Okay, thank you so much, Kennette. That was really excellent and provided a lot of insight into the current state of US nuclear policy and a good overview of where we've come from and where we might be going in future. So thanks again so much. Please do send your questions in to Kennette. We've got a few coming in, but always happy to have as many as possible. So yeah, please put them in the chat and we'll pose them in a moment. We're going to let the panelists ask each other a couple of questions first, but I'm going to turn now to David Cullen from Nuclear Information Service. Sorry for my sniffling, I have a bit of a cold, I apologise about that. I'll mute myself and I blow my nose. So hi Dave, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. Yeah, great to be here. Really enjoying the speakers so far.
Cool, good to see you. So hi, can you begin by introducing your recent research for NIST and what projects you're currently working on?
Sure, yeah. So NIST, Nuclear Information Service, we monitor what's happening in the UK nuclear weapons programme. We try to sort of pierce the veil of secrecy a little bit. We're currently working on a project looking at the UK's replacement warhead programme, trying to discern what is currently occurring with the programme, what its plans might be, what the eventual warhead might look like. I mean, this is very relevant to our topic today because there's almost nothing in the public domain that the government releases about this. It's really interesting to have an event with UK-US focus because we're having to go to the US to find out a lot of, a lot of information, which is not to say that the US has an exemplary record, it's just to say that the UK is substantially worse in this regard.
Yeah, could you expand on that a bit? Because yeah,
Sure.
that's another thing actually, which is in Alex's book, which is interesting, is that there's that tension between nuclear secrecy, but also openness and transparency. The US probably has the most expansive Freedom of Information Act in the world. There's this tension between nuclear secrecy and freedom and liberty and openness that we've explored a bit. But how would you describe it in the UK? How would you describe the secrecy and democratic deficit in the UK and its nuclear weapons? And with your work, what challenges do you face trying to understand what's actually just going on? How can you maybe improve the system with transparency and accountability?
I mean, I think it would take longer than we have to answer that last part of your question, but I'll have a stab at the whole thing. I mean, I think I feel in the UK, definitely we're treated much more as citizens than subjects. I mean, that's technically in constitutional terms what we are. There, obviously there are democratic institutions in the UK, but particularly around national security and that sort of area, I feel that the state is very much more closed than the US. So we have a Freedom of Information Act. There's a couple of things. I mean, it's a much more recent innovation than the US one, and I think, for example, it has a time limit built into it, which the US one doesn't. But I think the culture of secrecy is much more ingrained here, and certainly in the time that I've been working on this issue, which is coming up to 5 years now, it does appear to be going backwards. So, I mean, there's two sort of quite obvious examples of this. One's more specific, one's more general, but the more specific one is the UK has quite a lot of the nuclear weapons program is regulated by a public body, but the nuclear safety around nuclear weapons, around submarine reactors, and also the transport of nuclear weapons isn't publicly regulated. The Ministry of Defence has a department that is a sort of quasi-regulator, and since 2017 they've stopped publishing the safety reports of that regulator. Actually, I was with Peter Burt, who's actually on this call. He had a challenge to the Information Lower Tribunal to try and get them to release those reports, and it was really fascinating to see how that worked, because a substantial amount of the key evidence was provided in secret. So we were out of the room when that was discussed, and it's a really interesting window into how pernicious secrecy can be. The government's account was that there was a review around the time they stopped releasing this information that decided that it was dangerous to national security to provide the information they had been. I don't find that at all credible. We made a Freedom of Information request to ask. They have a single word assessment of safety, an assessment of their ability to maintain a good regulatory regime, and they've refused to release those one word assessments. And I can't see that Russia would be able to do anything with those single words, I'm afraid. But the Ministry of Defence's barrister was able to make that case in a closed session in the Information Tribunal. And there were things like one of their key witnesses was stumbling a little bit, and the barrister immediately moved to turn into secret evidence. I believe allowing that witness a bit of time to compose herself and stop saying things that were harmful to the government's case. So, I mean, that's quite a detailed example, but it's I think a really interesting one to how secrecy can sort of imbue the whole functioning of bureaucracy and cause a lot of problems. In more general terms, the integrated review that was released earlier this year, we saw a move back from releasing information about the number of deployed nuclear weapons, the number deployed on each submarine and on each missile, and that was justified in terms of sort of philosophy of strategic ambiguity that the government claims that they have. I find that also rather dubious. I'm not at all persuaded that hiding information is a good way to achieve strategic stability. I think clarity of capabilities and purpose would be much better, but that's the government's official policy behind which they hide a lot of stuff. I would love to see people who work more in sort of doctrinal space in the nuclear field challenging that, because I think it's mostly used as an excuse not to tell people things, and it's completely anti-democratic.
Yeah, sounds on the money there. I mean, one thing I'd highlight, or one person's work I'd highlight with regards to secrecy, is the work of journalist Ian Cobain. And I think he has a similar actually kind of summary of how information in the UK has been born secret since birth. And as Alex kind of highlighted, like the US seems to have taken some inspiration from the UK secrecy regime, because he describes in his work how, you know, if it's government information, it's by definition secret. Like if we've produced it, if it's in government domain, it's secret, and you can go somewhere else to get your information, but not through us. Going back to the idea of the UK and US, could you talk more about your current work on the nuclear warhead program, how that's going, the connections generally between the UK and US nuclear programs? Maybe touch on like the secrecy involved in that, maybe mutual defense agreement. I'm going around the house a bit here, but just if you talk about what you find interesting in that area.
Sure. They're very closely linked, as I'm sure a lot of people know, but the sort of quite amusing thing from my perspective is how you get very different accounts of how closely linked they are in the US compared to the UK. The UK is very keen to emphasize the independence of its program, but then you get things like the US possibly inadvertently announcing that the UK had a new nuclear warhead before the UK had. You know, you get sources in the US who quite offhandedly describe what the UK claims are sovereign nuclear weapon designs as being basically the same as their US counterparts. So you do get quite an interesting difference between the two sides there about how separate they are. But it's quite clear that they're very closely linked programs. And whilst I wouldn't say that the sort of traffic of benefits is entirely one-sided, it's pretty clear that the dependency is much more that the UK depends on the US. Talking in terms of warheads, it's pretty clear that the new warhead is unlikely to diverge very substantially from the US W93. The UK, for example, couldn't really do flight testing of a different warhead. I think we don't have a testing range for submarine missiles. We don't have the budget to use up missiles for those kinds of tests at that sort of pace. So yeah, it's very much a dependent relationship from the UK side. I feel like I'm rambling now, Tim, and maybe there are other points in your question that you wanted me to cover.
No, that's all good. So I want you to talk a bit about like your major report you produced in 2019 called Trouble Ahead, and it kind of, in that you kind of outline very clear terms and the costs and risks which are rising with the UK's nuclear weapons program, which some have said put the actual existence of the program in danger. Some of the government's own investigations into this, the official costings of this, or the state of the program, have raised concerns that can they actually be delivered. So what are the main findings in your report, and how has the government tried to address the problems you've raised in the last couple of years? Like, has the increase in defence spending really, will it address the problems, like the fundamental problems you outlined about the UK's replacement programme?
Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, the main finding of that report, which was released in March 2019, was that we said that the government was facing a trilemma, that the difference between their nuclear ambitions and their budget was substantial and was very difficult for them to bridge, essentially. What's changed since then is the government has put a lot more money into the nuclear weapons program, and that was one of the possibilities we foresaw when we were writing the reports. Obviously not what I would have recommended them to do. I'm sure that will have helped. I think it's very difficult to track sort of internal movement of money within the system and see exactly what that's been allotted to and what changes it will have made. It's worth noting that, you know, the big headline figure that was announced in the budget around this time last year of 16 billion was of a scale of the kind of budgetary gap that was being talked about at the time by the National Audit Office, but so it may have eased things, but it won't have solved all of their problems, and some of their problems were not solvable financially. they, one of the things that we spoke about, and I still feel is not appreciated as well as it should be, is the age of the current submarine fleet means that it's going to continually have reliability problems throughout the next decade and more, until the replacement submarines come into service. And there will be a tension between the UK's chosen nuclear posture, which is to keep the submarine at sea at all times, and dealing with whatever technical problems they have on those submarines safely and responsibly. And we know from the previous generation of submarines, from Polaris, that at the time the political choice was to send submarines out that probably should have stayed in dock and had repairs done to them. A whistleblower, I think at one point, said that they would just go somewhere and wait quietly on the seabed rather than, patrol around, because they wanted to minimize the wear and tear on the submarines. And obviously this stuff is completely opaque. There's secrecy around this. Some of it is justifiable, some of it's not, but it would be very helpful to have a clear and honest conversation about that, and about how responsible and safe continuous deployment at sea is going to be throughout the next decade. We won't have that discussion, unfortunately, unless the government radically changes things and radically reassesses their attitude to secrecy. I believe the DNSR reports are being withheld because they have some material that is problematic for the government's position in this regard.
And finally, can you similarly touch on what you see as the main problems, perhaps in the same way, with the atomic weapons establishment itself, the buildings and the infrastructure in terms of safety, security, management problems there? Not a week seems to go past, there's another kind of crisis or problem that seems to crop up. So how do you assess the current state of the atomic weapons establishment, and maybe what are some of the alternatives which we should begin thinking about if we're going to move towards someone away from producing nuclear weapons?
It's been under what's called enhanced regulatory attention for a very long time now, the atomic weapons establishment. So that is that's the second highest category of regulatory attention. There were two facilities in Sellafield that are considered more dangerous or more requiring of the attention of regulators than AWE. But AWE has been in this enhanced attention for a long time and has consistently failed to get itself out. They had a large inspection planned for, I'm going to get my dates mixed up now, but I think for late 2019, and they missed their window for having that, which would have got them into a normal regulatory position. I think around then, as people will know, so the atomic weapons establishment was taken back into public ownership earlier this year in July. That was quite a surprising development for everybody. We don't have a government who are very big on nationalisation generally, and yet they elected to nationalise this key quote unquote strategic asset. Certainly part of the rationale for that will have been that they are planning to build a new warhead there and they want to have more direct control. But it's been substantially hinted to me by people in the know that their regulatory headaches were part of the reason. I think possibly that they're missing of this the window to get out of regulatory attention around that time is probably a factor. We have to see whether this change will make any difference. The chief nuclear inspector is positive about this, but I've also heard him be positive about their prospects in the past. We'll have to see. They have some fundamental issues there. They have some very old stock in terms of their infrastructure, and the priority in the program, sadly, is not the best safety record. It's to keep the show on the road. As we were just discussing with the submarines, they will prioritize whatever they feel is necessary for maintaining nuclear capability over the most safety conscious course of action if they feel there's a tension there.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Dave, for that summary. Really interesting, and keep up the good work. Looking forward to your report on the warheads. So now I'm going to give the presenters a chance to ask a question, maybe to each other, however they feel they'd like to do it. So I'm going to start with Alex. Alex, yeah, would you like to ask Kennette and or Dave a question based on their presentations?
Yeah, for Kennette, I'd really love for you to talk a little bit more about how you think we ought to engage broader publics in getting these. I completely agree that that's a core function. How to do that? That to me, that's the I don't know what the dollar question it is. And for David, I'd really love, I'm very interested in comparing the US and the UK because they're so historically intertwined in their nuclear programs and things like that. And I'm just wondering what you think the long-term prospects are for the UK for either reducing secrecy or reforming secrecy. Is the deck stacked against it, or is it a possibility?
Go ahead, Kennette.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a difficult one, I think, especially now. And Tim has actually written quite a bit about this and the kind of doldrums of the disarmament movement that we seem to be experiencing. I do think there are a couple of signs that things might be changing. One is, at least in Congress, we have some senators and representatives who have introduced legislation which focus on the sole authority of the president to launch nuclear weapons. So to have some legislation around which to organize around, I think is important. And it's not obviously about disarmament so much as it is about reducing the dangers that we face every day. But I think it's an important step forward. And I think as I said before, I think the ban treaty can also be used as a way to raise public awareness, especially its focus on the effects of nuclear weapons. I guess what I thought for a while, and I'm looking at a couple of analogies, I suppose. I'm really struck by the success of the 1619 project in the United States, which Nicole Hannah-Jones with her colleagues at the New York Times put together a really stunning and extremely provocative idea about the legacy of slavery in the United States, and to have and turn that not only from a New York Times magazine piece but into a curriculum for schools. And of course, now we have a huge debate about whether that's appropriate and all that. But the point is, we're having a debate. And we are talking about slavery in a way and the legacy of racism in a way that we haven't really in a long time. And there are lots of things that have gone into it. But one of the things that I think has happened since the end of the Cold War is kind of a forgetting about the history and walking away from teaching about it in schools. I mean, it's that simple. The environment is, kids learn about, pandas on icebergs, out in the polar regions. They learn about environmental issues. They don't learn about nuclear weapons and history. And I think if we're going to have an informed public, as awful as the subjects are, and they are awful, I do teach about nuclear weapons at the University of Chicago, and I ask students to read Hiroshima, and they are almost always in tears. And I think we need to, it's miserable stuff, but it needs to be talked about and needs to be taught. So yeah, I think there are ways in which we could do a much better job in reaching broad audiences through the formal education institutions that already exist.
Thanks, Kennette. And Dave, would you like to answer?
Long-term prospects for secrecy. I also find the comparison really interesting. It was fascinating to learn from you today that the US cribbed UK secrecy laws. It's ebbed and flowed a lot. I mean, even in the last couple of decades, I think it's striking to me how much although there is a strong institutional preference, and I would situate that in the constitutional settlement in the UK for secrecy. It's interesting to me that the most open policy in the UK came about around the time that we had as far as I'm aware, the only Secretary of State for Defence who had a abiding interest in this issue, Des Brown, who continues to be active in the field. I think at the time he came in, they were taking some major decisions that were set in train, and he didn't have very much to do with how those played out. But I think that we saw after his time there, and this continued after his tenure as Secretary of State for Defence, new openness, a drive towards moving down the numbers of warheads that the UK had in quite a big way. We saw, the P5 process. He initiated that, although I think he's on record as saying he thought he was starting a disarmament trend, and he actually inadvertently started a cartel. But we can only make accurate assessments of the size of the UK stockpile because of the openness that came through around the time that he was in post. So it's around political leadership, I think. But I do feel there's a strong institutional bias towards secrecy, and it will take very inspired political leadership for that to change. And as Kennette has been saying, I don't think that kind of leadership can make very much headway without strong external forces, public forces. That's very difficult, and secrecy makes it more difficult because it's very hard to kind of get traction on these issues if you can't talk about them with any level of detail or sophistication. That's one of the reasons that this exists, and why I'm very happy and proud to work for NIST, is to try and provide some of that information, but it can be an uphill struggle for sure.
Thanks, Dave. Kennette, would you like to ask Dave and/or Alex a question? Oh, you're muted, sorry. Kennette, you're muted, yeah, thanks. There we go.
Yes, I would like to pose a couple questions. Alex, I guess you talked about secrecy as a way of controlling public debate. And I was also interested in the early history of secrecy, the role of Lilienthal here. And I wasn't aware that, in fact, at the time, Lilienthal and others were worried about the way secrecy might dampen public debate. They understood right away that this would be a problem for a democratic society, and yet they went on to do it. Not Lilienthal himself, but certainly others, and especially Lewis Strauss. But I'm interested in this secrecy to control public debate, and especially, can you say something about how Congress has reacted to this over time, and what role they play in controlling public debate or avoiding public debate, depending on their sense of things. For David, the UK played such an extraordinary role in the CND and in the disarmament movement in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. So I'd be very interested to hear your assessment of how the UK might once again provide leadership for Europe and for the United States as well in public mobilization for disarmament.
Thank you so much, Kennette. Alex, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really interesting that very early on, like even during the Manhattan Project, this question of public debate and democratic governance was one of the major concerns. I mean, it's the very first history of the atomic bomb was written during the Manhattan Project. This is the Smythe Report. And just to tie it back into the UK connection, the British were very opposed to releasing it because they did not understand why you would want to give away that much information. And they actually said at one point, well, I guess this is an American problem, right? In the UK, we would just not release this information. But one of the arguments was that we would not be able to mobilize for releasing it, was that if you don't have some kind of informed citizenry, they will do really dumb things and they will vote for policies that will be counterproductive as opposed to supporting things that would actually be effective. And Lilienthal was all about that. I mean, Lilienthal was involved very early on at discussions at the University of Chicago with scientists about the future of secrecy. He was very skeptical of it. He was involved in the Atchison-Lilienthal report, which is the international control sort of alternative to secrecy. And then he becomes head of the Atomic Energy Commission, and he ends up I really find him fascinating as a historical character because he ends up becoming exactly what he hates. He ends up embracing the secrecy, not because he wants to, but because the system is set up in such a way that if he doesn't embrace the secrecy, his new organization will probably be crippled and replaced by the military, which he sees as worse. And also because if anything is released that isn't supposed to be released, he gets hammered by Congress for it. He is vulnerable for this. And so it's actually Lilienthal who agrees to not release information about the plutonium experiments on people, even though in his heart of hearts, he knows this is totally incorrect and invalid. And I find it really quite an anecdote, really. I spend a whole chapter on Lilienthal because I'm fascinated with Lilienthal. He's very human, unlike Louis Strauss, who is terrible. But Lilienthal is very relatable. He's not odious in any way. And he also wrote a diary, which makes it very easy to trace his thoughts on these things. But he very much sees the evils of secrecy and spends most of his tenure as chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission trying to reform the secrecy system and failing utterly. He is worse than Strauss on secrecy by raw numbers, because at least Strauss, this is the guy who comes two after him, has atoms for peace and has an excuse to declassify lots of things. Lilienthal doesn't have any of that. He's the most secretive, but he's also the most regretful of that. And to me, that's very human, both very much the human condition, but also very much the difficulty of, even if you have somebody who wants to fix these systems on the inside, it's incredibly difficult because all of the institutional incentives are aligned in a way that makes secrecy the easy choice. Nobody ever lost their job by being too secret. They have lost their job by releasing too much information. And also, as Lilienthal knew, if you release information about the people about wrongdoings that were conducted before you, you get blamed for them. And this also happens in the US in the 1990s when Hazel O'Leary releases a lot of information. It doesn't become, wow, the Department of Energy, they're so open and great, we love them. It becomes, my God, look at all these abuses that have been going on for all these years. And so the reflexive response is to make it more secretive. And as for Congress is all over the place, of course, as in all things. In some cases, they encourage the secrecy by being ready to pounce on a political opponent who has been too honest, right? The Joint Committee on Atomic Energy is created with the Atomic Energy Commission as their oversight, but they are the most secret congressional committee ever and the most powerful one. They choose what legislation goes forward. They choose what debates go forward. At the same time, you also have congressmen who are congresspeople who are willing to challenge these things openly and willing to speak about them and to hold hearings and have audits. And so it's really quite a mixed bag. Congress is often the only recourse that people have everyday people have for lobbying for change and lobbying even for inquiry into these issues. So congressional hearings are a really important tool for this. And sometimes they are able to pierce into quite a lot of the secrecy, especially of these executive agencies. But they're tricky. They're another player in here, and they have their own institutional dynamics, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. But again, unlike even presidents, it's much easier to get your local congressman to do something. And that can be an immensely powerful tool for opening up some of these secrets and have been in the past.
Thanks for that great and thorough answer. Really appreciate it. Dave, turning to you.
How might we get back to where we were? That is the the big question, isn't it? I think if I knew the answer to that, I might not be on this call. I might be out doing it. But I would love to know more, actually, from some of the people involved who are still around in the movement, what their explanation is for why there was such a huge upsurge in public interest and public pressure around this issue at that time. It's really fascinating history, and I don't pretend to be a great expert in it. What's interesting to me, sort of reflecting on it now, just thinking about your question, is the extent to which it was bound up in another social movement, in sort of second wave feminism, and a big drawing of parallels between male domination and military domination, and the way that those two movements seem to knit together and find joint propulsion at a particular historical moment. I wonder whether there are possibilities around then. Perhaps we need to be talking more about nuclear colonialism at a time when reassessing colonial power relationships is such a big thing at the moment. So I think perhaps that might be one way that we could think about getting back to that scale of public pressure that we had then.
Lovely, thanks for that, Dave. Very interesting. I agree with you on that point. Did you have any questions for Kennette and Alex?
I mean, so many. They're both, said some really interesting things. The particular two I've got down actually for Alex. I mean, maybe I can sort of guess your answer to this, but I'd still be interested to hear you talk about it. Is to what extent you think that nuclear secrecy in the US was path dependent, came about due to particular decisions taken at particular times, and to what extent you feel it was more a sort of structural consequence of the pressures that the people involved found themselves under. And with Kennette, I'd be interested to hear you speak a bit more about how you feel the relationship works between secrecy and, I mean, what I'd sort of call institutional agenda setting, the way that bureaucracies have their own momentum in terms of setting policy and forming how decisions are taken. Because I think the interplay there is a really interesting one.
Okay, thanks, Dave. And thanks everyone for staying with us. We will have about 15 minutes for audience questions. So please hang on in there. I'll try and get your questions answered. We have a few, but yes, Alex, would you like to start?
Yeah, just briefly, this is the ultimate historian's dilemma, right? How much of this is individual agency, how much in choices, how much of this is larger structural forces? And the answer is always both, right? It's always a dynamic between them. I will say that there are structural forces that lead to these attitudes and processes and things going into place, for sure. But what I think people in at least the current environment, especially in the nuclear people who justify the secrecy, underestimate how much of it was due to very small numbers of people making very specific decisions. And so one of the things I try to do in my book, which is still very available for people looking for holiday gifts, is try and unearth exactly where those moments are, where somebody said, why don't we try it this way and not that way? Why don't we push this and not that? And you could imagine that if you replace that person with somebody who made a different decision, things could have gone in somewhat different directions. What different directions? That's, to me, the separate interesting question here. If we say there is flexibility in the system, we have to imagine where that flexibility could have led us for it to be an interesting thought. And I do try to do this in the conclusion of the book a little bit. What would it look like if we had not embraced nuclear secrecy? Would we still end up in a situation similar? Would it affect the Cold War in some ways? And I don't want to spoil things, but I will say that I'm a little bit skeptical that we could have changed things totally radically. Unless you imagine some system in which international control is really quite everywhere and profound, which would be very hard to plausibly imagine, not just because the US was lukewarm on it, because Stalin is the other person you're negotiating with, and he's not a great negotiator. He's not that trustworthy, it turns out, right? But you could have imagined a world, say, without probably McCarthyism. You can imagine a world without certain extremes. You can certainly imagine a world in which Oppenheimer's security clearance is never revoked. These things feel extremely contextual and the result of specific individuals. And you could also imagine a world in which some of these laws might be different. The law that governs nuclear secrecy in the United States and the Born Secret Clause and the restricted data definition, they came up with that sort of overnight. I mean, that specific clause, it was not part of the law. They got spooked by a spy scandal in Canada, and then they added the law, and then that became law of the land for till today. It's still on the books. That's the kind of thing where you say, well, that's really specific. You could have imagined them doing nuclear secrecy legally and structurally very different from what it is today, and that would have different outcomes. That isn't the same thing as saying there would be no secrecy, but you could imagine it deviating in interesting ways. So thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. And I suppose the counterfactual to that is what could have been worse. So without citizenship activism and pressure on governments, would we have had more nuclear use, for example? But I'm abusing my position as chair, so I'll move on to Kennette and ask her to respond, and then we'll move on to audience Q&A.
Great. Thank you, David, for that very difficult question. Let me see if I can at least give a plausible answer. The relationship between secrecy and institutional agenda setting. Clearly, secrecy allows for many things to go on without public view and without transparency. And I think that that's extremely dangerous. I mean, we're talking about Stalin as if he is unfamiliar to us. Well, I mean, we have in the United States with nuclear weapons, at least what one scholar calls a thermonuclear monarchy. Robert Dahl, a renowned political theorist, said that we were essentially allowing nuclear weapons to be kind of just run by a guardianship and making citizens wards of the state, essentially. So secrecy, I think, really does dampen, absolutely, the public view and public discussion. And it means that those in bureaucracies and in institutions have really kind of free reign. And that cannot be good for a country that says that it is ruled or governed by the people. I think there are institutional solutions. I mean, one of the things that we really are missing is the Office of Technology and Assessment in the United States. The Congress had an organization which had the power of independent investigations into science and technology issues. And on nuclear weapons, they were actually pretty robust at one point. The OTA was the victim of Newt Gingrich's political, essentially, assailing of the Democrats, and so we no longer have the Office of Technology Assessment. So there are institutional ways in which we could probably address some of these secrecy questions in an incremental fashion, but clearly secrecy, I think, just protects experts and policy people, and essentially makes illegitimate any citizen claims for participation in those decisions. And I think that is the tragedy, really, of nuclear weapons.
An excellent way to finish the questions. Thank you very much for that, everyone. The speakers, excellent responses, really interesting. I'm so glad we've had this panel today. I'm going to try and handle the questions in the most efficient way possible. So I'm going to start with first dibs for people who wrote in questions. So we have one from Marcus and one from Chris. I'm going to give each to the panelists and try and get through as many as possible. I hope that's okay. I've just got a note from Trish. What is Trish saying to me? She's saying, yes, she's saying maybe speakers may be prepared to stay on an extra little bit just to get through some of the questions. Fingers crossed they can. We're very glad that they can be with us for as long as they have so far. So I'm going to start with Marcus's question, which I'm going to address to Dave. So Dave, this is from Marcus Kern. He asks, how often are the Trident nuclear warheads refreshed? As these are never used, how long do they last? When do they go off? I think that means rather than going bang, how long can they last for? What's their life?
It's around 30 years from the point of manufacture. That's in broad terms, that was about the service life of the first iteration of the Trident warhead and about the length of time that was added to the service life by the Mark 4A upgrade, which is currently still ongoing. These aren't public figures. This is what we can discern from the public sources, but that seems to be about the size of it. However, the warheads are boosted, the primary of the warhead is boosted by tritium, which has quite a short half-life. So during that 30-year period, the warheads have to occasionally have their tritium replenished to ensure that they would still explode with the same yield.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Dave. Hope that answers your question, Marcus. So I'm going to address this question to Kennette. And you'll be pleased to know this is a very simple question, which is from Chris Davis. How can we stop the proliferation of nuclear arms?
Yes, well, there have been attempts for a long time to stop the proliferation. And actually, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has done a reasonably good job, considering that as many as 20 or 30 countries could now have nuclear weapons without the US and Russia coming together to prevent other countries from acquiring them. The record is actually reasonably good, given that there are many countries that could have nuclear weapons now. There are only 9 now out of what, 190 or so countries. And so I think it's fair to say that we've done a reasonable job. I think, though, that in the end, non-proliferation needs to be tied to disarmament. I think that as long as the United States, the most powerful country in the world, believes that it needs nuclear weapons to preserve its integrity and sovereignty, every other country in the world is going to want them. Why wouldn't they? As a deterrent against either the US or some other country attacking or invading them. So I think to deal with proliferation, I think we need to be serious about disarmament. It's exactly what the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty called for. It's what it promised. And so I think in order to make that a reality, we need to go back and live up to the promises that all of us made in that treaty that was signed in 1968, a long time ago now. So figuring out how to do that is really what needs to happen. And I see the ban treaty as a kind of it's kind of a booster shot for the NPT. It is a way in which we reaffirm the need to get rid of nuclear weapons and also to provide for remediation for those victims of the nuclear weapons production that's already taken place. So I think they need to be linked, and many people would like to see them uncoupled, but I think we need to bring them back together to deal with proliferation.
Great answer, Kennette. Thank you. So I'm going to address this a question rather, from Peter Burt to Alex. So to what extent do you think government and institutional secrecy over nuclear weapons drives secrecy in other areas of government, as opposed to being a symptom of a general secrecy culture in government?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer plausibly. But in essence, the conclusion I sort of came to is that nuclear secrecy is, again, the sort of rhetorical underwriting. It's what's writing the check for a lot of other national security secrecy, even stuff that has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. So CIA experiments in mind control, for example, in the 1950s, right? That has nothing to do with nuclear weapons, except that CIA experiments in mind control tie into a broader global framework, which, if implemented in different ways, could lead to accelerated tensions, et cetera, which could lead to nuclear weapons being used, et cetera, et cetera. This is the kind of way in which secrecy becomes very sticky and also sort of diffuse. And so in some ways, nuclear is a very practical origin of certain types of long-term secrecy, certain policies, certain ways of evaluating what is and should not be released, things like that. And in other ways, it became a sort of diffuse place where people would go whenever there's a court case about what are the limits of releasing information in the Cold War. A lot of the times you end up thinking hypotheticals like, well, what if the New York Times wanted to print, this actually came up during the Pentagon Papers, what if they wanted to print how to build hydrogen bombs? Would that be the limits of secrecy? And in fact, that does come up a few years later in a different case, whether you could print how to make a hydrogen bomb. But that's exactly the kind of way in which it becomes the rhetorical underwriting of these things. It's the extreme existential risk that then you start saying, well, if we all agree that's secret, then we can start arguing about how far away from that we still want things to be secret. And what's interesting is that a lot of the people who become really against secrecy start saying, even that shouldn't be secret. Even using that as the bar is pushing the whole window of secrecy way too far along to be useful, even separate from whether or not we should have oversight in the nuclear policies, which is obviously nuclear secrecy influences that, but it influences so many other things beyond that as a sort of idea as well.
Great, thank you, Alex. So I've got a question here, or two questions from Thomas Fraser, which might be addressed to you again, Alex, but I hope Kennette and David might chime in. So it's, the first is, what causes moments of greater transparency or moments of greater secrecy? And should we understand this as being linked to the evolution of the international system or rather domestic concerns? And would more transparency be favorable to disarmament? How can we, it might be he's saying, but can we correlate moments of greater transparency with moments of greater success for disarmament? So I guess the second question is the relationship between transparency and disarmament, and if there's any examples we could touch on with that in terms of progress on those issues. So maybe Alex, may to chime in on that, and then Kennette and Dave.
I'll let Kennette start. How's that?
Thank you.
Just to put her on the spot.
Yeah, thank you. Well, briefly, I would certainly address the second about the relationship between transparency and disarmament, because we do have some historical record on that. Which actually continues today. The transparency in the non-Lugar legislation, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program that the US and Russia undertook at the end of the Cold War, was exceedingly helpful and allowed the US and Russia to bring their number of nuclear weapons down by the thousands, and in a way that they could trust one another. We haven't touched much on trust, but it certainly is a key idea and concept that we need to explore, I think, in greater detail, because I think it underlies so many of the discussions that we're having about secrecy, and transparency and disarmament is critical. The New START treaty that the US just renewed with Russia also calls for transparency, for reporting mechanisms, for military to military relations, which are, again, provide for a kind of trust and a reassurance that each side is doing what it claimed it would do. So yeah, I think transparency is exceedingly important, and especially in transnational relations and international relations, as countries to reduce their nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Kennette. Would Dave or Alex like to come in on that? Dave, go for it.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say a historical example, but I do think that's just sort of re-emphasize what Kennette said. I think it's really important that the creation of trust and the maintenance of trust, I'm struck by the way that one of, within the 13 steps agreed by the NPT in 2000, transparency is seen as a precondition for disarmament. And what Alex was saying when he was speaking at the beginning, this idea of different models of security, I can't conceive of a secure world that's kept secure by nuclear weapons being esoteric knowledge that can be kept to certain people who can be trusted. A situation where there is mutual trust between everybody who's able to wield them is a much safer one, the one where we hope to keep from people knowing things that will eventually be found out. Yeah, sorry, maybe that was a bit rambly, but that was my thought.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. Alex, did you have any further thoughts on that?
I would just say that to follow up on both of these, but especially what Kennette was saying, it's very hard to make arms control treaties where you don't have some kind of transparency, because you want your arms control treaty to have verification, right? You want to make sure that's the trust. You don't want to write a treaty. This is the Soviets proposed their own arms control treaty in the 40s that just said, we'll just never make weapons and you just trust us. And everybody said, that's not serious, right? That you need verification in there. But if you have verification, you really quickly run up into secrecy. And that's both the case with the US and the Soviet Union. It's also the case with like Iran, right? One of the big issues with the IAEA and Iran for the last decade is that the NPT does not prohibit you having military secrecy. It just prohibits you having certain types of nuclear secrecy. And so they would find some site and they would say, we want to inspect it. And they would say, that has nothing to do with nuclear. We don't want to let you in there. It's a secret military site. That's not a very compatible situation, but that's also pretty common. And it's very hard to sort of prove that it's nuclear or prove that it's non-nuclear. There are some really interesting work, as an aside, by some friends of mine at both Princeton and MIT on how you would try and prove to another state that you had dismantled a warhead without letting them learn about how the warhead was made. It's called a zero knowledge proof. And it's enormously complicated and very interesting, but enormously complicated. And what I find so funny about it, and I've talked to both of these groups about this before, is that they find it more likely that you'll have a treaty in which we can get rid of nuclear weapons than we would end up in a world in which the United States and Russia would not be paranoid about their nuclear warhead designs, even though they both probably know what's inside those warheads, right? There are probably not any surprises to the weapons designers in these states. If you opened up their warheads, they probably look pretty similar. And yet is more likely that we would enter into a world in which we would be dismantling warheads than just being willing to show the warhead to the Russians and vice versa. And I have a quote in my book, which I sort of, it's a paraphrase for another famous quote, but to me, when I kept thinking, it's easier to imagine a world without nuclear weapons than it is to imagine a world without nuclear secrecy. And that's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, that's very strange.
Yeah, an apposite answer. So I'm really happy to take a question from Stephen Schwartz, who I hope is still on the call, but yeah, I've been following his work for a long time. I suppose a lot of people here have on nuclear spending. So he asks a really interesting question, which is, back in the 1980s, my former colleague, William Arkin, used to say that nuclear weapons were like cockroaches. They run when the lights come on. Historically, and even today, nuclear weapons states make decisions and about nuclear weapons and nuclear war policy, not only without any public input, but frequently without any meaningful legislative input. And secrecy was and is deployed to actively prevent public debate about these programs on everything from budgets to battle plans. Could you all expand a bit on whether you believe maintaining a nuclear arsenal, including on behalf of allies, and a democratic government are mutually compatible? Or to put it another way, can a democratic government ever be completely honest with its citizens about the nature, necessity and purpose of its nuclear arsenal? Great questions. So I'll start with Kennette, please.
It's a profound question. And I don't know that we will come with a very good answer today. It's interesting to think and to imagine a world in which we would have a much better, more robust democracy and nuclear weapons at the same time. I think the questions that Alex raises about secrecy are part of that. I mean, does secrecy really work? Who are we keeping the secrets from? Most foreign governments probably know much about what the US arsenal is like, and probably know more than the US public knows about nuclear arsenals. So the question of whether you can have nuclear weapons and a democracy, I think it depends on, how the nuclear weapons might be structured. I think under the current system, where one person, the president, has complete say over when they will be released, conditions, is unthinkable, really, in a real democracy. And yet, that's what we're faced with. I think, nuclear weapons are genocidal weapons. They do not discriminate. They are weapons of mass killing. And it's hard to think of people governing themselves who would think that perpetrating genocide on another society made any sense. Maybe I could be wrong, but I think that in the end, for a number of reasons, I think nuclear weapons are basically incompatible with democracy. And I think if that's the case, then it's not clear what kind of democracy we are currently living in. So these weapons render people superfluous. We are really not taken seriously, even as human beings. Yeah, I'm not sure that they are compatible at all.
Thanks so much, Kennette. Profound answer to profound question. Alex or Dave? Alex.
I'll just say that this is, in the history of technology, historians, this is one of the big questions since about the 1970s that have been asked, is that do these technologies bring with them inherent political systems? Are there technologies that are inherently anti-democratic, for example? And I have to admit, I don't love nuclear weapons, but I resist sort of feeling that it has to be sort of all of one thing or all of the other. There's democracy, there's many different types of democracies. Some are better, some are worse. I don't know who has the best democracy at the moment. I look at the UK and I look at the US and I don't know, all these systems seem to have a lot of problems with them. And they bear nothing in relation to Athenian democracy and things like this, right? There's all sorts of different ways that we could imagine democracy. There's also a lot of different ways we could imagine nuclear weapons being deployed or used or imagined and control. So I guess what I would say is, I think we could do a lot better than what we have right now, for sure. I don't think there's a lot of, I don't think it's a very easy to argue that we are in the best of all possible worlds at all. There's a lot of obvious problems. At the same time, do you need to necessarily jettison all nuclear weapons in order to have some kind of functional democracy? I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like you can have some kind of functional democracy, but like many definitions of democracy, it's going to be limited in some ways. Even a representative democracy in general is a limited form of democracy versus, say, the Athenian pure democracy where everybody is randomly picked by lottery and things like that. Like, we already live in somewhat compromised democracies because we embrace things like capitalism and, industrialization and having 300 million people somehow being run under one government and federalization in the United States. All of these are modifications. So I'm willing to say, sure, you can have some kind of functional real democracy of nuclear weapons, but I don't think that we have at all anything that is like a very one. We do have a system that the way that the Atomic Energy Commission was described by one of the people who wrote the laws creating it was an island of socialism inside a free market economy. And I think it's an interesting quote. It was actually meant favorably, but you can see that this is the idea that nuclear weapons may bring with them a different form of political reality. And the question is, where do you draw that line? You don't want to have the use of a nuclear weapon be open to popular vote. My God. We know that popular votes can go in terrible directions, right? All the time go in terrible directions, right? In both of our countries, united. But that being said, you also don't necessarily want it to be in the hands of one person, right? There might be some sort of compromises in between where you say, okay, if we have to have these weapons, there's ways to do this that don't feel as ridiculous and allow you to say, okay, we the people, if we don't like something, can imagine a route to change for it in a way that doesn't really exist at the moment.
Great, thank you, Alex. Dave, would you like to give your point of view?
I would agree broadly with what's already been said. I think it's a really complex question, and there are real issues of definitions that we could get very bogged down in very quickly if we wanted to really get into the weeds. I think it's quite clear that they militate against democracy in many ways. I think also, a popular vote against on the use of nuclear weapons, I would like to make a strong case that the people who might be targeted by them might also want to have a say and be represented. I think a key principle of democracy I would maintain is that everybody affected by a decision gets to vote on it. or gets a say in it. Maybe voting is not quite the right way to think about it, but yeah, maybe I'll leave it there.
Great. We're supposed to finish at 2:45, and we're basically on the last minute, but I do want to ask one final question to Kennette from Elizabeth McElderry, who I used to work with at Medac, and she asks, how does the UK and US secrecy affect our demands for transparency, for example, from Iran in nuclear negotiations with them? I think that's quite a useful question to end on. So just if you could give a response to that, Kennette, I'd really appreciate it, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, in US and UK negotiations with Iran, the transparency seems to run in one direction, at least under the terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that the US has since withdrawn from. The transparency in the program in Iran was really quite extraordinary. The inspection regime of the IAEA was robust. The US understood more about Iran's nuclear program than it may even understand about its own nuclear program. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, it was certainly very relatively public and transparent. I'm not sure the negotiations themselves, I think, are not transparent. I'm not sure what the questioner is trying to get at, but and negotiations often are not made public, in part because it can hamper the negotiations themselves. And so being able to talk freely and in private to try and iron out some of the thorniest problems of give and take in those negotiations, I think is important. Wendy Sherman's book, Not for the Faint of Heart, talks about some of those issues as she negotiated the JCPOA. And I think in some ways there is a role for secrecy there, at least until the final agreement can be met, just to give the participants some kind of leeway and a chance to be honest and to change their minds in the middle of a negotiation. So I hope that addresses the question. Thank you.
I think so, and thank you for your answers generally, Kennette and Alex and David, and for your really interesting and knowledgeable answers to my questions. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for bearing with each other. Thank you for bearing with Zoom, and thank you for staying for so long with the questions. I apologize to Giorgio, Taylor and Stuart. We didn't get to answer your questions, but if you forward them on, if you want them answered, I could forward them on to the panelists. And yeah, I'd just like to say thanks again to everyone for attending. Do stay in touch with Nuclear Information Service. We hope to have future events like this in the new year. And so have a good Christmas and New Year, and hopefully see you soon and stay in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.